my ad-libbing talents or lack of them comes before. Okay. The person I'd like to introduce is someone I've known for a long time. I think it's someone that we all need basically in cryptozoology. Someone who doesn't just, you know, sit in an armchair and read reports and say that is or that isn't, and that's the end of it. This guy actually goes out and looks for them, which is something we all need in the kind of modern era of cryptozoology. I don't know whether we call him our Indiana Jones or perhaps our Wolseley Freeman, but that's who he is, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce a good friend of mine and of all yours, I'm sure, Mr. Richard Freeman.
Well, hi! Thanks, Carl. Now, generally, when I talk, I'm very animated. I like to stalk up and down like Magnus Pike and wave my arms about, but I think I've got the beginnings of an attack of gout, which is very good for my goth credibility, having gout, but it's not very good for me stalking up and down, so I think I might spend most of this this lecture sitting down. Right, now, the other thing is I've got some slides, which means me interacting with a machine. Usually when I interact with a machine, I'm putting my boot through it, or a brick through it.
If you don't want to, I'll do it for you.
What do I press on here to make it go?
You say next slide, David.
This wall.
Yeah.
It's the button facing the screen.
There aren't any buttons facing.
Give it to David. Give it to David.
Richard, just say to Dave next slide.
Okay, that's better. Because I'll just lose me around with it. Right, can we have the first slide, please? Oh yes, that's worked. Okay. Now, the expedition to Guyana came about due to a number of things. I had heard of an organisation called Guided Cultural Tours in Guyana in South America, and they, amongst other things, did cryptozoological tours. They would take you in search of the giant anaconda. Now, fortuitously, at the time, we were approached by a gentleman called Sam Bray, so I never actually met face to face, I only talked to him over the phone. And he represented a games company called Capcom that do video games. And they had a new game called Monster Hunter 2, and he had dreamt up this gimmick whereby they could advertise their game by sponsoring us, real-life monster hunters, to go out and look for monsters. Now, I absolutely loathe video games. They're one of my Room 101 things. I think they're brain-rotting nonsense. Kids should be reading books or going out with their friends, building gang huts and going fishing or something like that. I think they're a bit of a blight. But he was offering £8,000 towards a South American expedition, so I bit my tongue and said yes. Yes, we would like this very much. It's very rare the CFZ gets much sponsorship. Usually we're approached by TV companies, maybe 20 times a year, who want to do this, that and the other, all sorts of wonderful ideas, and at the 11th hour it all falls through, and we get nothing. So this was, usually we pay for it out of our own pocket. So this was a pretty good thing to be sponsored £8,000. So we decided to find out more about guided cultural tours and the giant anaconda sightings in Guyana. And I contacted the man in charge of it, who was called Damon Corrie. And he was actually an Amerindian. He wasn't a foreigner, he wasn't a Hispanic person that had gone over there. He was actually one of the native peoples, and he was a hereditary chief of the Eagle Clan Arawak tribe. And we had quite a long email exchange, and he told me about a remote lake called Corona Falls with a mind-bogglingly huge anaconda in it. The story went that he spoke to some hunters who had seen an anaconda in this place that was so vast that they ran away in terror. And when he asked how large it was, they pointed to a big palm tree, and they said there was a tree similar to that lying on its side, dead in the lake, and the anaconda was crawling over it, and its head and its tail stretched beyond the length of this tree. And the tree was 30 foot long, which would have made the anaconda at least 40 foot long. Some things you should know about the anaconda. It's the largest of the known snakes. It's a boa. It lives in South America. It's primarily aquatic. Unlike a lot of other snakes, it doesn't lay eggs. The female retains the eggs in her body, they hatch out inside her, and she gives birth to live young. That way, the anaconda has broken its last link with land, and a lot of the time, the big ones very rarely come out on land. So they can spend all their time in water, buoyed up by the water, getting larger and larger and larger, and the $100,000 question is just how large do they get? The largest one that's ever been measured was around 28 feet long, but there have been reports of ones well over twice that size in the South American jungle. And in parts of Brazil, they're known as manatoro, which means bull killer, because they're supposed to be so massive they can grab a full-grown bull, constrict it, and then swallow it whole. So there was supposed to be an exceptionally big snake in a certain lake. So we wouldn't have to trek through great swathes of jungle, we wouldn't have to explore huge areas. We had a narrow target area, we had one lake, we decided to go for that. Damon also told us of another creature in Guyana called the Dai, which he said was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot-like creature, a hairy giant said to lurk in the mountains and was much feared by the Amerindians. And also something called the water tiger, which was a strange aquatic carnivore. Now, I read up a little on the water tiger in the past, and I was pretty convinced that what people were talking about was the giant otter. The giant otter is an enormous creature, can grow to over 6 feet long. If you can imagine an otter 6 feet long, pretty spectacular sight. They're not usually aggressive to human beings, but there has been at least one case of a female otter killing a human being. That was in captivity, and apparently she thought the keeper, I can't remember which zoo it was in, but she thought the keeper was a threat to her cubs and tore his throat out. And they're quite capable of killing people. So I thought maybe the water tiger was possibly an exaggeration of the giant otter. Can we have the next slide, please? That's another view of the anaconda. They're much more, in proportion to the length, the girth is much bigger than a python of the same length. They're not only the largest snake, but they're very much the bulkiest and the heaviest as well, and that's solid muscle. They don't see too well. The eyes don't have focusing muscles because they live mainly in murky water, so they hunt mainly by scent and vibration. The eyes can only detect light, dark and movement. They can't really focus in. Can we have the next slide, please? That's Corona Falls. That is the area where the giant anaconda was supposed to lurk. And apparently at one end of the lake there's a lot of boulders and rocks that make this sort of little labyrinth of caves, and the monster anaconda is supposed to have its lair in there, and that's where we wanted to get to. Next slide, please. There's Dame Corrie, he's our guide. He was the guy I contacted, and fascinating chap who stands up very much for Amerindian rights, which are very much being eroded in Guyana. The expedition members, aside from myself, consisted of Lisa. Do you want to give them a wave, Lisa? Lisa Dowley, who amongst other things is an archaeologist and a photographer. Dr. Chris Clark, there in the red. Dr. Chris, he's the old lag of the expeditions. He's been on just about every one. John Hare sitting next to him. And a chap called Paul Rose, who's not here tonight, a journalist who goes by the name of Mr. Biffo, and he used to write Digitizer. So we all got together and off we went to Guyana with Damon Corrie. We got into the capital, Georgetown, and I've been to a lot of scruffy, scraggy, nasty looking places in my time. This was scruffy, scraggy, nasty looking, but there was nowhere like it that had such an air of imminent violence about it. It felt like it could explode at any minute. No one thing, but it just felt menacing, nasty, petty, snide, vicious. It was probably the most unpleasant place I've ever been to, and I've been to Plymouth and Bradford. Thankfully, we were not there very long. Damon took us down to the native village of Pukori. Some people call it St Cuthbert's Mission, but I hate that. I hate missionaries coming in and imposing Western views on native people, so we made a point of always calling it Pukori. And completely different to Georgetown, Pukori felt cosy, nice, safe, you could leave your door open. Wonderful place. And there were lots of nice surprises waiting there for us. Can we have the next slide, please? There, that's Paul Rose, or Mr. Iffo. He's holding a very beautiful rainbow boa. One of the things that Damon does, he breeds endangered species, but he also captures non-endangered species for the pet trade. And that was one of the ones he captured for the pet trade. Very beautiful. I'd never seen a colour morph like that before. Next one, please. There. That scorpion, you can't really make it out of that, it's a beautiful green colour. Apparently a brand new species, doesn't even have a scientific name yet. And he put a cricket in for the scorpion to eat. Those are the babies on her back. He put a cricket in for the scorpion to eat. Apparently it looks like the cricket might be a new species as well. So it's a new species eating another new species. Now at Pukori we were told about the Dai-Dai. And there'd been an encounter with a Dai-Dai just 2 years before at a place around about 30 miles from Pukori. It happened between Pukori and the next village along, and a couple of Amerindian kids were walking home from school, a brother and a sister, when, according to the brother, a huge hairy man walked out from a stand of trees, grabbed the girl, hauled her away. She was never seen again. The police never even bothered to investigate this because they're Amerindians and they virtually have no rights, and nobody over there cares about them. But nothing was ever done. She was never found. There was no official investigation. And next slide, please. We only stayed a couple of days in Pukori, and then we headed out into the depths of Guyana. We had to go back to Georgetown briefly to catch a bus down to a place called Letham, which is in the south of the country, and from there we could go out into the wilds, the target area we wanted to get to. When this bus turned up, it looked like it was held together by rust and chewing gum. And I thought, this is never going to, the 40-hour journey, it's never going to make it there. The seats had no cushions, there was no air conditioning, it was incredibly uncomfortable. I finally managed to fall asleep, only to have dreams about going on a very long journey on an uncomfortable bus. At some god-awful hour of the morning, it breaks down, much as I thought it was. A couple of hours waiting, another bus arrives, which is marginally better, and finally gets us where we want to go. As we're running late, I am having to abridge this a fair bit, but you can ask questions at the end. We get to Letham, spend a day or so in quite a pleasant hotel, then we strike out from the wilds, and our first target area is a village called Taushida and the surrounding mountains. So, we meet up with a couple of local guides, one of whom is called Kennard Davis, who had lots of stories to tell, and started off towards Taushida. Now, I'm a creature of the warm summer months. I have a morbid loathing and dread of cold, and usually I get on quite well in the tropics. I enjoy it in tropical Asia, particularly. The climate in Africa is quite nice, it doesn't bother me the least. But here, it was unbelievable. Now, we were on the grasslands, not the rainforest. We were on the South American savannah, so there was little or no shade. Now, to tie in with the release of Capcom's game, we had to go in November, which is the dry season, and it was unbelievably, viciously, savagely hot. The heat was almost like a physical thing pounding down on you. The walk was 6 miles. To me it felt more like 60, and I collapsed a number of times on this old dirt track on the way up to Taoshida. It was an absolute nightmare. Finally we got to the village and made camp. Next slide please. It just so happened that in this area, a couple of years before, a hunter had stumbled across a cave that contained some Amerindian remains that had never ever been seen by the outside world. And because we were in the area, we thought we had a bit of spare time, we'd go and see them. Because you can't, even if you're looking for something else, you can't really turn down a great opportunity like that to be the first Westerners to look on something really special. So we were taken up a mountain to see these wonderful relics. About halfway up, Lisa falls off the mountain and manages to break her thumb. Luckily, she only fell 17 feet instead of several hundred, but she spent the rest of the expedition in considerable pain, not only with her thumb, but with her foot that she damaged as well. But she soldiered on, nonetheless, and didn't let it deter her to see this cave. It was quite a shallow cave, but there were these huge earthenware pots. There were the bones of an adult man and the skull of a child somewhere between 9 and 12, together with several artefacts including some beads, bits of broken pottery and the tusk of a peccary, which is a South American pig-like animal, and it had been turned into a necklace. And we were allowed to take a look at these, film them, photograph them, and as respect to the dead, we all had a fag, and had a drag on a fag. Because apparently blowing the tobacco is a sign of respect for the dead. Now, I don't smoke, but even I had a drag and looked dead hard and grown up when I was doing it as well. We were allowed to take a few bits back for examination, not the bones, but we were allowed to take a little bit of pottery and some glass beads. And Lisa had these looked at, and well, it did turn out that the beads were glass, so it would have to have been after the Westerners got here, well, not pre-Columbian, so sometime within the last 500 years when Westerners brought over glass beads because the Indians didn't have them. Nobody knows exactly who this person was. It's been suggested he was a shaman or a chief or someone important, and the child might have been a sacrifice buried with him, but the long and the short of it is we don't know. But we were the first Westerners to see it, and as far as I know, even the so-called academics in Guyana, and here it's so-called in very big letters, have not seen this, and I hope it stays that way. On the same mountain, Kennard, one of our guides, told us that back in the 50s a die-die had been seen. A man had been out hunting and he'd got 2 dead birds in each hand. He'd reached the top of the mountain when he saw what he described as a huge hairy man. It's never an ape, they say, it's a huge hairy man. They say it looked like a white man, but enormous and covered with shaggy hair. He saw this thing asleep in a sort of hammock made out of vine, and he was so terrified he ran all the way back down the mountain to his village and found he was still clutching the birds in terror. And he felt, actually he became sick, so scared he became sick for a while afterwards. Kennard himself had never seen the die-die, but he had seen something else. Now, Guyana is one of these places that turns out to be like a cryptozoological menagerie. You go after 1 or 2 things and then you turn up all sorts of other things as well. Kennard told us he'd seen a tiny red-faced man, a red-faced pygmy, and he was the first person to talk about this, but we heard many others who had seen these little people, and he described it as being 3 to 3.5 feet tall, naked, not hairy like a monkey, but naked and with a face painted red. And he said back in the 1970s, his uncle had owned a moped and he would drive it along track, and at a certain area, the little red-faced pygmy would jump out of the bushes, jump onto the back of the moped and catch a lift, and it'd cling on, and it always got off at the same place. It'd jump off again and run off into the bush. If it never did anybody damage, but it had this weird habit of jumping out in front of people with this bizarre grin, leering at them and frightening them. But it never actually did anybody any damage. Now, whilst we were camped at Taoshida, Damon released a bombshell that Corona Falls was 70 miles away as the crow flies across the savannah. Bearing in mind it nearly bleeding killed us getting 6 miles in this heat. Because of the heat, there was no way we could get a boat there, the rivers were too dry. There might be a vague possibility we could get a helicopter there, but that's something we'd have to think about. But he could take us to some other places where anacondas have been seen. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, that's, you see, when you work with slides, I always tend to get ahead of myself. That's the big pots that the remains were in. Next slide, please. That's Lisa's broken thumb after falling off the mountain. I fell off 3 mountains and down some rapids in Russia. I didn't get a scratch. Next one, please. That's Kennard. He was the guy who saw the little red-faced pygmy. Next slide, please.
He's getting there. He's getting there.
Now that's something else we did before we left the area. We decided that we couldn't get on foot to Corona Falls, but there was some other stuff we could check out in the area. That is T-Bang's Rock. We went out one evening to look at T-Bang's Rock, which is a massive boulder about 30 feet high that sits out in the backside of nowhere on the savannah and has a strange story attached to it. T-Bang is a weird little goblin-like creature, completely different from the red-faced pygmies. He's this little man who's supposed to go around at night touching children, and he transmits diseases when he touches them. And after the children die, he goes and digs up their bodies and turns their bones into flutes, and you can hear him playing his bone flute while sitting cross-legged atop T-Bang's Rock and occasionally throwing the bones in the air with glee. He sounds a lot like a South African goblin called Tokoloshi that's supposed to roam around at night touching people and transmitting diseases. Can we have the next slide, please? That's another view of T-Bang's Rock. Unfortunately, we didn't see T-Bang while we were there, but we're thinking of getting some t-shirts printed up saying, "I've been to T-Bang's Rock." The next one, please. So we set out for somewhere called Crane Pond, where there were supposed to be anacondas. Once again, the going was incredibly tough. Unbelievably, awfully, dreadfully tough. It's probably the toughest expedition I've ever done. Not so much in the danger of it, but just the physical slog of doing it. Just putting one foot in front of the other was a nightmare. Every step you took felt like a mile in the heat. It was unbelievable. But it was just getting dark when we got to this place, and we were rewarded with a wonderful sighting of a giant anteater, a female, and there you can see a little baby on her back. And we came across her in the grass, and Damon very bravely ran behind her and ushered her towards us so that we could film and photograph her as she ran past. And once again, if cornered, the giant anteater has a formidable set of claws which it uses to tear open termite mounds and anthills, and they have been known to disembowel people when provoked. But she was only keen on getting away, but we had a really good look at her and it was absolutely fantastic. Can we have the next slide, please? Crane Pond. We got to Crane Pond. The water was very low. It was punishingly, savagely, brutally hot. In fact, it was so hot that one day, rather than suffer the heat, I waded into the middle of the pond and hid under some short, scraggly trees to get out of the heat, and got eaten alive by mosquitoes, which was infinitely preferable to suffering in the sun. Chris Clark and John Hare, in an absolute, a very brave but absolutely lunatic mission, walked off across the savannah to get to some sort of trading post where there might be some pop we could drink, instead of having to drink water filtered through various bottles and things, so we could drink it. Now, when we were in Sumatra, in, what was it? It was 2004, the second Sumatran trip. We were looking for a lost valley deep in the jungle, and we were stopping on a remote farmhouse in the jungle when John gets this hankering for pop and goes out with the guide as it's getting dark and walks miles and miles and miles to a trading post to try and find some pop, and he's gone all night and we think something's happened to him and he's been killed by a tiger or something. But he comes back hours later with some pop called frambozen, which is brewed locally and put into old Fanta bottles and relabelled as frambozen, which I believe is Dutch for raspberry. It tastes like old flat warm Vimto with soap suds in it. But that was Sumatra, I've digressed. Off they go across the savannah, they're gone for a few hours, they come back, they've got pop, which is like manna from heaven. But to walk around in the midday sun in Guyana, utterly insane. There's a legend attached to Crane Pond that back in the 50s, some cowboys were camped there, and there was supposed to be a dragon living in Crane Pond. And it said, and the saying goes, "Don't sleep too deeply by Crane Pond, or the dragon will take you." They heard some immense animals stirring in the waters of Crane Pond, and a strange sound, like deep breathing. So one of them went to get the horses, and another one started firing rounds off into the water, and they ran away, never seeing what actually it was in Crane Pond. But big anacondas, when they breathe, do make a strange sort of snoring sound, so it could have been a very big anaconda. We got up early in the morning to look for anacondas. There is a trail of an anaconda there, slithering through the swamp. The one that made that would have been somewhere between 15 to 17 feet long, so large but no monster. We didn't see a single anaconda there. We saw tracks but no anacondas. After a couple of days there, it was decided to move on to another place called Cashew Pond and try a look there. Can I have the next one, please? That's another view of Crane Pond. Next one, please. Oh, got ahead of myself there, but there we go. We moved on to Crane Pond, which looked much the same as Cashew Pond. Once again, an agonising nightmare getting there. And we hoped there'd be less biting insects there, but we were wrong. There were about 10 times as many. And as well as mosquitoes, there were vine flies, and they were all over you. Even at night, it's blisteringly hot. It doesn't even begin to get cold until about 2 in the morning. So you're awake all night with heat and insects. I've been bitten by all sorts of things on expeditions. One jolly night in Sumatra, John, Chris and I picked 100 leeches off our legs around the campfire. It didn't bother me at all. I've had ticks all over me, including my unmentionables in the Gobi Desert. That wasn't very nice. But the insects here are terrible. There were these things called vine flies, which are so tiny you can hardly see them. They bite like hell. Now, I have got a picture taken by Lisa of my arse after it got savaged by vine flies, but I thought it's too horrible to show you. It looks like a giant, overripe, white strawberry covered in these little pips, but the pips are actually bites, and it was quite horrific. Once again, no anacondas. It was just too dry, the waters were too low. We'd gone at the wrong time of year. So it was decided once again to move on. We came to a place called Point Ranch and met up with some of the locals. The guy in the middle there, in the cap, is another guy called Joseph, and he had some interesting stories, and so did some of the people at Point Ranch. Next slide, please. The guy there looks a bit like Freddy Krueger. he's called Elmo, and he had seen the water tigers, and he said that he was adamant that they weren't giant otters. He said they were spotted like jaguars, but they were not jaguars. They ran and hunted in packs, unlike any otter or New World cat. He said that the larger ones brought up the rear, whilst the smaller ones, which you assume to be the cubs, ran off in front, flushing out prey. They didn't live habitually in water, but they lived in and around water. They didn't usually attack people unless they were provoked, but people were afraid of them. And he had seen them several years ago, actually in some mountains behind Point Wrench. Next slide, please. That's the mountain where the water tigers had been seen, and other stuff happened on that mountain as well. Right, next slide, please. That's Joseph, one of the guides. He had a number of stories to tell. Back in the early 70s, he had seen a water tiger, and he had seen actually a dead one killed by a hunter who had skinned it, and he said the head looked very like a tiger. The body was white with black markings on it. It was about 10 feet long, including the tail. Kennard had also seen water tigers, and the ones he saw were just plain brown. Joseph had another story to tell about this mountain, and he said, back in the 1970s once again, there was a plane crash on the mountain. And the parents, the pilot, apparently there was only the pilot in the plane at the time, paid him to go up in the mountains to try and retrieve their son's body. So he took a blanket up to bring the body back with, went up into the mountain, he's pointing to it there. It doesn't look too big, those mountains, compared to other mountains I've seen, but he got hopelessly lost up there. Finally, he finds the wreckage of this plane. The body's been decapitated, badly burnt, but he'll bring it back anyway. Pulls it out of the wreckage, starts to go down the mountain, gets even more lost, and he's up there for day after day after day until finally he runs out of food, except for the body, which has been nicely cooked by the fire, so he has to eat part of the body. He ate the arm, apparently. How he explained this to the parents of the unfortunate pilot, we never did find out. Can I have the next slide, please? Back in Letham, we met this man here, a former chief called Ernesto Faris, who once again was a fountain of information. He runs a little fish farm now in the forest around the foothills of some mountains near Letham. He said that a friend of his had once seen the Dai-Dai, and he'd seen a female Dai-Dai with a youngster. I believe he said she was suckling it, she was nursing it. And when he saw the Dai-Dai, he blacked out, woke up again, and afterwards started to get sick and finally died, and he actually blamed his death on seeing the Dai-Dai, as if something to do with seeing the Dai-Dai had somehow cursed him. Now it's very similar to some beliefs we encountered in West Africa a few years ago, when we were on the track of a dragon-like beast called the Ninkananka, a huge serpentine creature with a crest. It was believed that if you saw this creature, you would die within 5 years of seeing it. One witness we talked to, who said he had seen one of these things, said he soon afterwards he began to get very ill and get lesions and become very sick, and he had to go to a holy man who gave him a potion that made him better. So whether this is psychosomatic or whether it's all nonsense, we just don't know. But that wasn't the only story he had. When he was younger, he had seen one of the red-faced pygmies, and he said these pygmies lived in the jungle, often underneath trees. They didn't harm anybody unless you disturbed their homes underneath the trees. Sometimes they'd make little pots that you find in the jungle, but he didn't have any. He said that they were interested in tobacco. They would always come and take tobacco. If you left tobacco out, they'd come and take the tobacco and run off into the jungle with it. Whether they smoked it or chewed it, nobody seems to know. But he'd encountered one of these little red-faced men that came, took some tobacco, ran back out into the jungle. When he was younger, he'd also had an encounter with a water tiger. He was on a boat with his uncle when something grabbed a hold of the boat and started violently shaking it, so they had to grab onto overhanging branches to steady the boat. And his uncle told him that it was the water tiger, though he didn't actually see it. It could have been a big caiman. We don't really know. But he was a very interesting man. He said that still the bellowing roar of the daidai is heard from time to time in the mountains behind where he lived. But we didn't really have time to go and investigate. Another thing he told us about was a sighting of a very small caiman. Caimans are New World crocodilians. They're related to... They're related to crocodiles and alligators. They're more closely related to alligators and crocodiles. They're more aggressive than alligators, but not nearly so dangerous as certain types of crocodile. A lot of them are very small as crocodilians go. The smallest known one is Cuvier's dwarf caiman that grows to about 5 feet. But this fellow said he'd seen a smaller one. He'd seen a caiman that had a red stripe down its back and was only about 3 or 4 feet long. And he said it was making a very loud bellowing noise, much louder than he thought such a small animal would make, out of all proportion with the size of its body. He'd seen it in a little stream in a cave at a place called Wassaru, and he could show us where he'd seen it. The weird thing was that he said it had 2 tails, and he even drew for us how it had 2 tails. Now, occasionally, a lizard, when it loses its tail, will grow a tail that forks into 2 tails, very rarely. The same thing has been known to happen to salamanders. Never, ever recorded in crocodilian. What he may have seen was actually 2 together mating, and the male was making a bellowing sound. And we thought we'd check this place out, Wassaru. Next slide, please, mate. That's Dr. Chris at Wassaru. Wassaru is basically a collection of massive boulders, some of them the size of houses, all so close together that they form little caves and streams go through them. Next one, please. There's John, and the next one, please. That's sort of, you get the sort of idea of what it's like. We went into these caves and you had to sort of squeeze your way down to the boulders, and it looked to me like a great place for a small caiman to go. It was quite cool, so the animal could go out there, maybe estivate there if it needed to. There was water, there was sand in there, there was plenty of food if it needed it in the form of bats and small fish and things. Ideal for a tiny dwarf caiman of some sort, but there was no evidence that there was one there, but it looked like a very fitting place. So, even more strange creatures, a whole menagerie of them. Next one, please. Stories didn't end there. We'd more or less come to the end of what we were doing, because we only had 2 weeks, and we were really banjaxed by the climate there. It was a bit like being held down and punched in the face, that you couldn't get to this lake we wanted to get to. We couldn't get to Corona Falls, which was really bloody irritating. We tried to get there by helicopter, but we found out there's only 2 helicopters in the entire country, and we'd have to wade through loads of red tape to get hold of one. We might even have to go into Brazil to get one. So there was no way we could get up there. But we did hear some more interesting stories. This picture here is where we went out for a meal with Ernesto's family. They invited us around for dinner, and over dinner we heard some interesting stories about one of them concerned a huge skull found at an open cast mine in Guyana, where some relatives of Damon were working. It was supposed to be ape-like or human-like, but absolutely huge. And it seemed to vanish. I believe it was a Canadian company that owned this open cast mine, but a whole village saw this huge skull, and it was taken away by people from the company and never seen again. Another story that was reported in a local paper was that after some flooding, a creature rather like one of the lizard men that Carl Schuker was talking about earlier on was found washed up. Now I can't recall if it was dead or alive when they found it. Was it dead, Lisa? Yeah.
Yeah, it was dead.
Yeah, but it was found after some flooding. He couldn't remember what paper it was in, but it was one of two papers. And when I got back to Britain, I checked up in their archives, but their archives just didn't go far enough back. So yet more strange stories. While we were waiting, we decided we couldn't face another 14-hour drive back when I got off the bus, so we decided to take a little plane back. Unfortunately, we couldn't charter a plane to get us to Corona Falls, but we took a plane back, and even around the airstrip where this plane was, there were strange stories. When they built the airstrip, they had to knock down about 20 or so termite mounds, and in about 11 of these they found human remains, what they call crouch burials, where the skeletons like that, but it looked like they'd been put in the termite mounds and then the termites had built over them. Damon says he has no idea about this. It's nothing to do with any Amerindian tribe he knows of. It's completely unique as far as we know. We met a rubber tapper whilst we were waiting for the plane, and he had seen the bones. He'd also seen one of the red-faced pygmies. With his father, when he was a boy, he had seen one of these things in this area, looking at him, and he threw a stone at it, and it fell down on all fours and ran away. He was the only person that said it moved on all fours. Everyone else said it walked on its hind legs, but it could have just been crouching down and running away from him like that. We don't know. He'd heard of the Dai Dai, but had never seen it. He'd never seen the water tiger either, but he had heard of it. He also told us about something called the Guyana, which is a sort of witch doctor or wizard that lives in the wilds of Guyana, and to which all kinds of strange powers are attributed to them. Only men can become them. They usually leave you alone unless you anger one of them, or they're being paid to do something. And the Guyana can pass his powers on like a teacher. It's supposed to be able to become invisible and shape-shift and all sorts of things like that. All sounds a bit odd until you realise it might just be a language barrier. There is a certain type of frog called the giant monkey tree frog from Peru, and its secretions, according to the local Indians, would turn you invisible in the jungle and would give you great strength and would stave off thirst and stave off hunger. Now, the chemicals in its secretions have been looked at, and they seem to be able to mask human scent. So when you're in the jungle, animals are mainly using the sense of smell. If they can't smell you, you are, in a sense, invisible. And it also does seem to stave off feelings of hunger and exhaustion and thirst. So maybe the magic of the Kayanama is just knowledge of local plants and animals and the chemicals they produce and how to use them. The plane, when it arrived, was more like a van with wings, and Mr. Biffo, Paul Rose, isn't a big fan of flying in very small planes. We got into it, he was a bit tense, but after 5 minutes after we took off, the back seat of one of the pilots sheared off and fell straight into his lap, and the pilot didn't even notice, which didn't endear him any more to these little planes. But finally we got there. We had some brief time back in Pukori when we heard some more stories of big anacondas being seen, and since I've come back, Damon's contacted me and said some very large anacondas have been seen nearer to Pukori. Mr. Biffo had the good sense, instead of going back to Georgetown for a few days, to go on to Barbados for several days. We were stuck in Georgetown, the rest of us, and we had a day at Georgetown Zoo. Now, I'm a zookeeper myself, and I'm an ardent supporter of good zoos. They're vital for conservation. But Georgetown Zoo was an absolute nightmare. There was a fully grown lioness in a cage that could have been no more than 6 feet long by 4 feet wide, you can even turn around. There were jaguars in tiny cages with no water, a giant otter in a tiny filthy pool, caimans and anacondas in filthy water, anacondas with no water whatsoever, even though they're aquatic animals. They had allegedly had two manatees in this pool full of rubbish with a big sign saying no fishing, which about 30 guys were fishing in, whilst keepers just lay around lazily chatting and laughing. I have nothing but contempt for Georgetown, and I'd nuke the place if I could. We were glad to get out of it, and we had a day with Dane Corrie's family on Barbados, which is a beautiful island, and we managed to see the Chase Tomb, the famous crawling coffins of Barbados. I don't know if you've heard that story, with coffins that moved about inexplicably, big heavy lead ones. We saw the Chase Tomb. It's empty now. The coffins have long since been reburied elsewhere. We had a lovely tour of the island, but we were only there for a few hours. I'd certainly like to go back for a week or so. As for Guyana, it was really frustrating not to be able to get out to Corona Falls where the monster anaconda was. And we didn't even see one anaconda, not one poxy ordinary sized anaconda, which was very annoying. So we're hoping to get back out there next year, maybe in Easter, when it's cooler and wetter and you can move around more easily. I'm sure the giant anaconda does exist. I think anacondas get much, much, much bigger than the textbooks say. The red-faced pygmies, I think, are a primitive type of modern man. New tribes are being discovered all the time. I think they're a elusive tribe of human people. As for the die-die, well, I think that's some sort of relic hominid, and I'll be talking about relic hominids a bit more tonight when I talk about Russia. But in essence, that is a very much abridged version of the Guyana expedition. And if you want the whole story, warts and all, and everything else that happened, you can buy the book, which is on our store for, I believe, £10. And I will sign it.
In fact, not only you will sign it, Chris Clark will sign it, I'm sure, and John Hare will sign it, and Lisa will sign it.
I'm not signing anything.
Oh yes, you are, dear boy. Tim Matthews is a friend of mine.
So has anybody got any questions?
Yeah, we've got a few minutes to kill, Richard. I'm totally rejigged the programme. We are still just about going to be on time, even though the programme of events that is happening this evening is nothing like the programme that was written down that's going to happen this evening. So I'll be very grateful if people do not leave their seats.
Any questions? Have we got a runner? Have we got a mic?
Have I got Greg or Ross? We have Lisa, she's a runner.
Any questions, anyone?
Where's the best place to stay in Georgetown if you're there?
Oh, yes, we stayed on the one nice street in Georgetown, which is near the Prime Minister's house. Can you remember the name of the guest house we were in, Lisa? It's in the book. But there is one really nice guest house. It does good food, it's clean.
As the cleanest guest house in Georgetown.
Mr.
That would be a
Biffo.
hard standard to achieve, I would imagine.
It was very nice, but Mr. Biffo stayed with his taxi driver because he was going away earlier. And he said there was more wildlife in his house than outside. Things running around all over the place and crawling over him.
And if you were offered the job of head of the Georgetown Tourist Board, would you accept it?
No, I think I'd be the head of the Wiping Georgetown off the face of the earth committee. Right, man at the front here. Michael.
How big do you think anacondas can get?
I think a really, really big anaconda can reach 60 feet. I think the stories of them reaching 100 feet and more, maybe when people have seen them swimming and they've been pulling a weight behind them that makes them look longer than they actually are. But a 60-foot snake is a terrifying prospect by anybody's book. Any more questions?
Have you any idea how much these things weigh and how long they live?
Well, nobody really knows how long anacondas live. These big ones may be very, very old indeed. It's the females that are the big ones. Males are relatively small. As for weight, they are certainly the bulkiest snakes in the world. A 60-footer would be certainly weighing much more than one of the giant bulls you see in agricultural. A couple of tons of muscle, maybe. That's your cotton stock.
Greg?
Are the reports of the little red-faced chaps, are they more, I mean, are there more of them in the past than there are now? Or
No, a lot more of fairly contemporary, or, within the last... we're not talking about stuff from Victorian times, we're talking about things that have happened fairly recently. Our main guide, Damon Corrie, he was a bit embarrassed about it. He admitted seeing one when he was camping a few years ago. He said that something undid, slipped to his tent and looked in, and it was one of these little red-faced pygmies up, leering at him like that.
Has anyone reported red-faced chapettes, pygmies, or are they always sort of either or, really?
Well, they seem to, all the ones that we talked to, they seem to think that they were men. They said little red-faced men. I think they would notice the breasts if it was a naked female. But maybe, if they are an undiscovered tribe, maybe the men go out foraging and the women stay in the bush. We don't know.
It's just as far as the die-dye, some of the research I did concerning a pioneer of the Guyanese land, Matthew French Young, his father was also a pioneer. I found research that they recorded what they called Bushmen from the late 1800s and the early part of the 20th century. In fact, Matthew French Young had actually witnessed a die-dye, or Bushman, as this guides told him.
And he saw a giant anaconda as well.
Yes, he did.
Any more? No more questions? Right, I think that's it for questions.
Richard, I'm sorry that it's all untruncated.